to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Alex Martin, and today I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host. We've recently heard about the ins and outs of the cost of spraying this year, but there's another question that's kind of looming on the horizon. What's happening in terms of supply chains this year? And are we going to finally be able to reach a correction point in 2023? To help us learn more about the discussion, we've got two fantastic panelists joining us. Michelle Klieger, who is owner of Stratagerm, and Barry Prentice, who is a professor of supply chain management at the University of Manitoba. So Michelle and Barry, thank you so much for joining me today. And we're so excited to dive into this discussion. But before we get started, I thought it might be good to start with some introductions. Michelle, I know we had you on recently to Seed Speaks, but I'll let you start today and give us a little bit about yourself and Stratagerm.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about the discussion today. I'm glad to be back on Seed Speaks, and I'm looking forward to learning from Barry as well. So as Alex said, I am the founder and president of Stratagerm Consulting, an agriculture and business consulting firm. I work across the supply chain. I am an agricultural economist by trade. I teach economics at a university, and I work with everyone from growers to food companies to distributors on how we produce our food and trade it and make sure people are fed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. And Barry, tell us a little bit more about yourself and the research you do at the University of Manitoba.
Well, I believe this is my 37th year at the university, so I've been here a long time, and I've seen a lot of changes. When I came here, the cur weight was still active. We went through that and the various changes. I noticed just an article recently on the wheat board's anniversary of its demise. And, the grain transportation has been a topic of interest to the University of Manitoba academics for a long, long time. So I've been quite immersed in that, but my area of expertise is broader than that. I teach transportation economics and logistics, but I also have an agricultural background. My PhD was actually in agricultural economics, although focused on the transportation side.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Barry. Well, with that, introductions out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into some questions. And if you're in our audience, make sure if you have any questions, let us know. We'll address them while we go through our discussion. Michelle, my first question is starting with you. There's been so much that's affected the supply chains this year and within the past 2 years. I think we have to look at this from kind of a broad perspective. But what are you seeing currently in terms of supply chains in North America?
Yeah, so the supply chain discussion right now is really focused on higher prices and shortages. I think that from a purely economic perspective, we would say that there's a misalignment. So we have too many of some inputs and not enough demand and too much of other inputs. And so we're just not aligned with what is needed. And so how did this happen? I agree with you. We need to go back a little bit further. There have been a lot of very big supply chain shocks in the last few years. So if we go back to 2017 and 18, we had the US-China trade war, which stopped the flow of goods in some directions. It slowed things down. Prices got higher. It created a lot of uncertainty, and we moved sourcing around to try to avoid some of those tariffs. And then the pandemic led to lockdowns, which suddenly killed supply and demand. But then as global lockdowns eased, we saw that demand come back. And in some places, in some places, the supply also came back, but not always. And so over the last couple of years, we've really realized that our goal with globalization has been to have an extremely efficient supply chain. We wanted things to move from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. The lowest cost producers were the ones that supplied the world, and consumers benefited. However, with that, we saw that to achieve that efficiency, we had to give up on resiliency. So when we had these big shocks in the last couple of years, it was pretty clunky. And so between trade wars and pandemics and lockdowns and regular wars. There's just a lot of holes left that everybody's trying to adjust with.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I didn't even think to factor in the trade war into my thought process when I think about supply chains as well. So thank you so much, Michelle. Barry, I know you've kind of already established that one of your particular focuses and passions is on transportation, which I think is on everyone's minds lately because we've been seeing so many interesting things. What have you been seeing so far in terms of transportation and freight?
Well, I tend to be a bit more optimistic that some things are going to get better. I mean, for one thing, that the pandemic seems to be easing, or at least our effective locking things down has changed. Consumers are returning more to traditional patterns of consumption, so more services and less goods, and that'll take some of the pressure off the ports, because the real story has been one of congestion. We've just simply overwhelmed the ports, overwhelmed the railways, the trucking industry, everything moving goods in excess of what we normally would have moved, because normally that money would have been spent on going to hockey games or having meals out or movies or whatever. That didn't happen. That's now back. And so that's changed. In the case of the Canadian situation, last year was a drought year. So we did have a short crop, and that may have been a blessing in some ways in terms of transportation, because we also had this very unusual weather event that wiped out the railways for several weeks. And I don't know that they're completely back even yet in terms of the repairs. But we could have another one of those anytime. And the point about resiliency is really top of mind, because we have a very long distance to get from here to the coast, and there's lots of places where problems could arise where we've never seen them before, and we just can't predict that. So being ready to move quickly, fortunately the railways are, to accommodate any disruptions helps. But we also have a situation right now where oil prices have been very high, and the system has been short of oil for various reasons. So we see a lot more oil moving by rail than would otherwise be the case. And I know some people have been concerned about what does that mean for the grain movement. I'm not so concerned. I think the railways have certainly taken it into hand already, but there are some rising cost pressures just because of oil and the higher fuel prices.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Barry. And I know we're going to get to gas prices in a minute, which is going to be an exciting thing to talk about. Michelle, what are you seeing in terms of like agriculture inventory? I'm thinking of what are we seeing in terms of, do we have enough seed this year? Do we have enough crop protection? Things like that. So how's supply looking? And are we seeing anything like increased prices due to inflation?
Yeah, I think that you have put together a good panel today, because I can already see how the conversation is weaving in and out with each other. Specifically to your question, though, last time I was on Seed Speaks, we did talk about inflation. And one of the challenges with inflation is when prices are perceived to be getting higher, people want to buy up more before the price gets high, and they want to hoard and stock up. And unfortunately, that causes the prices to increase even more. And if the price falls, you now have very expensive inventory sitting out back. So that is something to be concerned about. And so there are, people that are sitting on excess right now. A lot of the companies, though, now, because we've had so many of these disruptions, are, thinking about how to plan ahead. For my podcast a couple of weeks ago, interviewed J.R. Peters, a fertilizer company, and they project out 4 years now. Or have for a while. And so now that, we've seen these disruptions for several years, they're able to build that into their modeling. So on some of these things, we have seen energy prices come a little bit down. We have seen fertilizer prices come a little bit down. We still see the delays and shortages, and maybe the reduction of the variety that used to be available. But it seems like people are right now able to get what they need. My time in the seed industry showed me that there are a lot of different types of seed, from vegetable, which is produced everywhere in the world, counter seasonal production, breeding material, which does still have to move around, and so you do need those long lead times. The commodity seed that is produced in North America seems to be more available. But on the grass seed side, bad weather last summer is putting pressure on how much is available and how much carryover there is. So for the seed sector, it's really dependent on what crops you're working with. But I do see some of the other features beginning to work themselves out.
Thank you. I think a part that goes into that is exactly what we're talking about too, which is the difficulty finding transport and freight, along with an increase in gas price that we've seen this year. I know in the U.S., I think outside where I live, outside of D.C., we reached over $5 a gallon, which is not my favorite price to see. But Barry, are you still seeing an issue in terms of getting inventory transported places?
Well, again, it depends. It's very spotty. It's going to be some places there will be problems and some places not. But I think this issue, you point out the gas prices. One of the things that we have to remember is the whole world runs on diesel, not gasoline. The equipment is diesel for the fields. The trucks are running on diesel. The aviation industry is diesel, and the ships, which used to use bunker C, that's a terrible sort of bottom of the barrel, and a lot of pollution that came from that. There's a world agreement to stop using bunker C and use diesel fuel. That is putting a huge pressure on the diesel markets. And I've already seen evidence that the diesel price and the gasoline price are going to widen. And part of the reason is that when you crack a barrel of crude oil, you get a certain proportion of diesel and a certain proportion of gasoline. And you can adjust it a bit, but there's still, some fixed issue there. We're going to have a demand for more diesel, which means we're probably going to get more gasoline. And we may well see as drivers lower gasoline prices, but rising diesel prices. And that's going to have a bigger impact on the supply chain, both for ocean freight, but also for the locomotives and for tractors and combines, what have you.
Perfect. That's a great point, Barry. Thank you so much for correcting me and letting us know that it's more the diesel we should be worried about right now. I think.
Can I ask a follow-up question for that?
Absolutely, Michelle. Please feel free.
So with that, I'm sort of curious, are we seeing the same innovation in diesel then too, to try to increase efficiency that we talk about in cars and other places?
I think the reality is that there's always a push to try and be more efficient. I don't think that's the issue. I think the real change is a surge in demand from the marine sector. And it's a very big part of the world economy, and it's going to take up a lot of the resources, as well as the fact that we have already, some tight supplies. So I just think that be prepared for higher diesel prices. In fact, if you're a producer, maybe you might want to forward contract a little bit if you can get your diesel now. I know it looks like it's a high price today, but it might get even higher.
Great advice, Barry. I think before I move on to my next question for you both, I got an audience question in, and I think it's going to be great to set us up. It's from Ashley Robinson, and she'd like to know, what effect is the war on Ukraine having? It's seen a lot in headlines today. It's affecting the world food supply. But what about the ag products supply, including seed and fertilizer, have you been seeing pop up? And I'll let whoever would like to take a stab at it first, please feel free.
Well, we know that a lot of those supplies from the Ukraine and Russia are coming out of the Black Sea. And that's been more or less blocked for various reasons, one of which is that the insurers are unwilling to provide insurance for ships to go in and pick things up. So it isn't just out of the Ukraine, it's also out of Russia. We are seeing, some movements now of grain coming out of the Ukraine, but it's just a trickle compared to what they normally supply. And so I don't think it's going to have a major downward impact on grain prices worldwide. I think, in fact, they're going to stay fairly robust until we finally see the end of this event, or in a couple of years' time until we adjust otherwise. But certainly the fertilizer and grain in that part of the world, in the Middle East and Europe and so on, and Africa, they're going to be much more affected than we are.
Thank you so much, Barry. Michelle, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
Sure. I agree that, we saw that after the invasion in February and March, that we had almost all-time highs for some of these commodities, especially wheat, and then which is produced in the Black Sea, as well as Russia being a huge producer of fertilizer. And so that fertilizer really needs to be followed through the supply chain, right? So that grain that can't get out would be produced, consumed immediately or close to immediately. But the fertilizer has this ripple effect because fertilizer increases yields in other places. And so that having less fertilizer in some places could dramatically reduce yields. And so now this is a food security and food production question into the future and not immediate. And that could affect future supplies, as well as it's been very hot in a large part of the Northern Hemisphere. And so that is also challenging crops and putting down supplies. So ag production happening all over the world and moving all over the world means that all of these factors weigh in, and it's kind of how they fall out at the end.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you. Now, my next question, I think this frames up well from the discussion we've been having, but it's a question again for both of you. Is it starting to look like supply chains are on the path to correction? Or should we expect some bumps in terms of 2023? I know neither of you can predict world events happening like I don't think we were anticipating Russia to attack Ukraine, but as best as you can, I'd love to hear some of your opinions. Michelle, maybe we'll let you start this time since we let Barry take the lead last time.
Sure. So I would say that we are getting used to a world and supply chains that have disruptions. And as that becomes part of our operating premise, that things will smooth out, that we are starting to think more about resiliency and building in redundancy. And so that might mean that companies source 80% of their material abroad and 20% at home. And so they're always guaranteed that they have some access. There's a lot of conversations about reshoring or nearshoring. So making sure that your inputs are coming from close by and that they're not as much being traveled around the world. I think that all of these play into it. And I think that companies and individuals are changing their behavior. We've had this world of just in time, and it started with manufacturing in the 80s and 90s, where you could make just what you needed and sell it, and you could purchase your inputs as you needed them. And it was a move away from inventory. And in our personal lives, we have, next day delivery or 2-hour delivery. And so we also are used to getting things on demand, but 18 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever it is of being told, supply chain disruptions are why you can't have your couch this week or this month. I think that we are all starting to change our behavior and build in that slack and build in that extra time and redundancy and keep some inventory. And all of that is the resiliency. It's expensive, or it can be expensive, but it will smooth out some of the bumps. So that's really where I see the supply chain moving in 2023.
Great. Barry, do you have anything that you'd like to add as well?
Well, I think the most important thing we should all keep our eye on is interest rates, because they do have a broad effect on the whole economy and it's the world economy. The U.S. is raising interest rates. Canada's raising interest rates. This will have a very significant impact. I think, the fact that the oil prices are coming down is not because the oil companies finally found their heart and decided they were charging too much. It's because demand is slackening. And that demand is already slacking. I know I hear lots of stories. Oh, we can't find people. We can't hire people. We're still, I think, just in the momentum of that past period. The interest rate impact is still starting to take effect, and it's going to take even more effect because there's going to be another interest rate rise in September. Amongst other things, this is going to make holding inventories more expensive. So it's sort of contrary to the view of just in time. I mean, that was because inventories were expensive and you tried to reduce them. As interest rates rise, there's going to be more desire to not have inventories, but it also means that storing grain, for example, we might see the margin spread out on those futures contracts because just the cost of holding grain is going to be higher.
Perfect. Thank you both. It sounds like I like the kind of knowledge that planning ahead is going to be important as we continue into 2023. Michelle, another question I had was around commodity prices, because I think that kind of ties in here as well. What have you been seeing in terms of commodity prices in the US? And are we seeing any impacts on them economically because of what's happening right now with supply chains, things like that?
Yeah, so commodity prices are up. That's a very, we all have talked about inflation. So we're definitely seeing commodity prices elevated. The last 7 weeks or so, I would say that they have come off their peak. So there has been a little bit of downward movement on especially energy prices, which has, reduced fertilizer prices. We did have those headlines about some grain leaving the Black Sea region. And so the wheat and corn and soy cotton have all come off of their highs. The first couple days in August, we've seen a little bit of that movement back up. So the good news is that, prices have stopped going up immediately on some of these commodities. They have retraced a little bit, but the other half of that is they're still significantly higher than 2019. And so even that little bit of reprise is still much higher than what we're used to or what had happened again before COVID. So this is still a situation in flux, I would say. And as we've talked about, the transportation costs and the interest rates are also going to continue to move the prices. I would also say that, commodity prices aren't the only factor in food prices. And so even though we've seen some easing on commodity prices, that has not translated into the grocery store, which is where much of us get our information on inflation and where prices are going.
I like that comment that we all get our knowledge from the grocery store. That is very true. Barry, kind of a similar question to you, because I know Canada could be a little bit different in terms of commodity. What are Canadians seeing in terms of commodity prices, and do you have any major concerns on the horizon?
Well, in the first place, I'd never like to tell an agricultural audience that high grain prices are a problem. That's actually something that most people hope for and yearn for, is to have higher grain prices. And Michelle's absolutely right that something like 80% of the cost of food is determined beyond the farm gate. And it depends on what commodity you're talking about. But, they used to say that the box that the beer cans come in costs more than the barley that went into the beer, and which is absolutely true. So, the grain prices are moving up, but it's all the other costs in the system. So it's the interest rates, it's the energy prices, it's the cost of labor. All these things are adding to the cost of what we're doing, and we're seeing that at the grocery store. So we're probably going to see much more consumer concern, and a lot of the blame obviously is going to come back to what's visible, and that's the agricultural prices, which don't really deserve that much credit for the price increases, but they'll get blamed for it. In terms of the world markets, and maybe for the seed industry to think about, we're heading into the predictions are coming true for climate change. What that means is we have 1 year it's a drought, and the next year we're getting drowned here in Manitoba. And it can be a hot summer and a cold summer. We may, and there's already work going on to look at different seed varieties that can tolerate higher temperatures, for example, in canola. It may well be that the seed handlers have to have more varieties of seed available and more stocks of seed, depending on the season that's coming forward, in order to accommodate that. It isn't something we've talked about very much, but I can see that as part of the future.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point to make, Barry. And I think seed companies are desperately and quickly looking into that, for especially abiotic stresses and just stressors in general, to see if we can combat that Mother Nature aspect. I think all of us wish we could control Mother Nature and get us the best outcome every single year. I'm looking at the time, and we have about 5 minutes left. I had about 2 questions left, but I'm going to leave off with just one last question for you both. And we might start with you, Barry, this time because we started with Michelle last time. But final question for you both. What is your advice to agriculture and seed businesses right now as 2023 approaches? What do they need to be prepared for anything?
Well, I guess, the general advice is when you have interest rates rising, try to keep your debt levels low and be cautious about taking on more debt, especially in an uncertain market. So, that's just general advice that people would have. I don't think that we have a lot of changes happening in transportation, except I don't see the rates coming down. If anything, again, diesel prices going up, it was going to make freight rates higher. And I know that reduces farm level returns because we get the export price less transportation at the farm level. So those are issues I would watch for. But I think in terms of the general world economy and market, Canada's still in a very favorable place. I mean, we're less affected by heat than other places. And we are starting to see the world become more concerned. I mean, the Americans are starting to move on climate change. I think we're really long overdue in moving on this. But again, it's back to having the commitment to make some of those sacrifices today instead of paying a lot more later.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Barry. Michelle, I'll let you give the final piece of advice today. Do you have any advice for people as we move into 2023?
Well, it seems like we're finishing on weather. So I think that everyone probably needs to talk to my daughter, who is 5 and says that she has controlling the weather powers. They need some improvement because we have not had rain in New England in months. So there's that. But outside of being able to control the weather, which is always a dream of everybody in agriculture, I'm with Barry on paying attention to the interest rates and your cost and the prices, because prices going down is a problem. Grain prices going down obviously is a problem for producers. But if grain prices are falling faster than your input prices, or if you stocked up on your inputs at a higher price because you were worried about them getting higher, that all makes the margins and the math very difficult at the farm level. So your debt does get more expensive when your interest rates are going up. We see labor prices still going up. And so there's a lot with the high energy and high fertilizer costs. There's just a lot on that side that is pushing the cost of production up. And then we have the fluctuation in grain prices, which we all watch daily. But within those trends, how does this make sense for your business and how do you navigate it? And for me, it's always keeping the numbers top of mind.
Perfect. Thank you. And I agree, Michelle. I think we all wish we were like your 5-year-old and could control the weather, but maybe one day we'll all develop those superpowers. Thank you so much, Michelle and Barry. I think that's about all the time that we have today. And thank you to everyone who joined us and watched in the audience. I know I've learned something, so hopefully you were able to take home something fun as well to tell a story at your dinner table. If you like this topic, funny that we ended on weather, because next week my coworker Allie Roden is going to help us learn a little bit more about high wind and lodging in corn as harvest nears and how to deal with it. So it should be pretty fun, and hopefully you'll be able to learn something, but maybe not how to control the weather. We'll see you all next week, and until then, have a great week. Bye, everyone.